everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
And it's me, Jackie.
I thought you guys were switching orders.
In 2022.
Oh, 2022. Okay. Gotcha. All right. Well, welcome everybody to the podcast that's about behavior analysis and the research that supports the continuation of the science. That's a new tagline. I don't think
I like it.
I don't think it rolled off the tongue as much as our original podcast about, what is it? I don't even remember what our original tagline was. Yikes. In any case, every week we talk about behavior analytic research. Every week we talk about research related to the field of behavior analysis. And since it's September, for longtime listeners, you know what that means. We're in the throes of Supervision September. Hooray!
That's my rave. That's like when you go to a rave. That's my rave.
Oh, that was a vuvuzela.
Oh, I was thinking a rave.
Okay.
And then people are like, do. Obviously, I haven't been to a rave since the 90s, but whatever.
Sounds like you're at a sporting event. You got some jock jams going there.
You don't know what kind of rave I've been going to. I've been going to sport raves.
Okay. A sport rave. In any case, this is our third episode of the month, meaning our third supervision content. However, we're doing something a little different in that this is the ethics of supervision, meaning you can decide that, you know what, for this Supervision September, I really want 2 supervision CEs by listening to ABA Inside Track and an ethics one instead. Or you can say I want 3, but it doesn't matter because we actually have 4 episodes this month. And next week, we're going to be continuing this topic with a full-on just ethics episode. So you're welcome, everybody. It's just supervision, it's ethics. It's all up in your grill for September. The end.
Right. So this episode can count as 1 ethics CEU or 1 supervision CEU. Your certificate, if you order one, will say ethics or supervision, and then you, the viewer, get to pick which one you enter it into.
It's like choose your own adventure. When you enter one in, a monkey will come out and sing songs to you. Or
choose wisely.
You will die.
So that's exciting.
Yeah.
I'm sure I will get questions about it, so I'm trying to make it clear now how that's going to work.
Yep. So, given that our topic is the ethics of supervision, today we will be continuing our conversation on supervision, specifically on how providing supervision well is itself an ethical professional behavior you can engage in.
Hey, Rob.
Hey, Jaggy.
Can I tell you why I was excited about having this topic?
Of course you can. Go for it.
Thanks. So, one time, this is the backstory of the ethics of supervision. One time, I was lying in bed, where I do all of my great thinking, and I was thinking about my ethics class, and this is before they had the ABA training and supervision curriculum, and I was lying in my bed, and I was thinking about ethics, and then I was like, why don't we ever talk about, like, being an ethical supervisor? I mean, we have a few in the code, but it doesn't really, like, talk about how we can do that. And then, like, just sort of do this whole outline of, like, a talk that I wanted to do. Do you remember this, Diana? This whole outline. I'm like, I'm going to talk about the ethics of supervision, and don't you know it? Because that's what happens. Then the 5th edition task list comes out. The supervision is included in the task list. So then I was like, well, I guess I don't need to do this entire ethics of supervision outline that I created. And so I have a plethora of articles that align with ethics and supervision. And so these articles were part of a 2-class series. So I took 2 classes on ethics and supervision. And I thought it would be helpful since we don't really talk about supervision and ethics together. It's kind of like Diana said, they're either or, right? But they shouldn't be. They're kind of besties holding hands. You can't have one without the other. It's like peanut butter and bread, unless you're...
Or love and marriage.
Well, right. Not just kidding.
You know that song, right? Love and marriage.
Yeah.
The theme song to Married with Children, of course.
Yeah. But that's
a real song.
What this whole idea came about was that I originally wanted to do this whole entire workshop on the ethics of supervision until the BACB got into my dream.
Scooped you on it.
Yeah, they're like, "Ooh, Jackie, great idea!" And so then they made APA training and supervision part of the required coursework.
At least you know it was a good idea.
Yeah, right?
That's true. It's like, I want to invent the airplane, but somebody had already done it. But at least I know it was a good idea. But anyway, back to ethics and supervision. So we've got four articles that Jackie had either wanted at the time of writing this curricula that didn't exist, but now they do. But the thought was there. And then fully formed from your mind, someone else, you incepted someone, and they gave us these articles. Or they're articles that we discussed in the past, but either need a little bit of an update because of the new task list and the new ethics code, or we just liked them and we thought that they were relevant enough that, we're not going to make it our primary article, but, hey, let's bring it back a little bit. Bring back some of the points.
Yeah,
right?
We got 2 new and 2 old. So the 2 new represent the newness of our field, right? They were published in the last 2 years. And the 2 old are oldies but goodies, but warrant always a review when you're talking about supervision and ethics.
All right. So our articles for this episode are Supervision Behaviors of Board Certified Behavior Analysts with Trainees by Hajigamoseni, Drasgow, and Wolf from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2021. Promoting Ethical Discussions and Decision-Making in a Human Service Agency by LeBlanc, Onofrio, Valentino, and Sleeper, also from Behavior Analysis and Practice 2020.
Obviously,
spoiler alert.
Ones, yeah.
They're all those are the 2 new ones. And spoiler alert, they're all from Behavior Analysis and Practice. I'm going to save myself some time here. Towards a competency-based, ethical, and socially valid approach to the supervision of applied behavior analytic trainers by Turner, not Sophie Turner, the actress, as I said in the episode we actually talked about this, but Laura Turner, Fisher and Luiselli from 2016, and Taking Full Responsibility, The Ethics of Supervision in Behavior Analytic Practice by Sellers, Alai-Rosales, and MacDonald, 2016 as well.
So that one haunts my dreams. Taking full responsibility of the supervisee. I cannot tell you how many bad dreams I've had of coming into a school that I've been consulting, and all of the RBTs that I supervise have done something super unethical, and they're like, "It's your fault, Jackie." So my dreams are what BACBs or BCBAs fear.
Oof, that's scary.
We don't want that.
No. So, some fun background information if you only recently have been certified, or you are in the process of being certified, or maybe you've been certified for a year or 2, but you haven't really taken the plunge into supervision. You decided to wait, hone your craft, get some experience under your belt before becoming a supervisor. But there was a time in the not that long ago where to be a BCBA supervisor, you just sort of needed to be a BCBA who said, sure, supervision sounds fun, I'll do it. And then you filled out these little checklists and you signed them. And there were these weird timelines that weren't exactly every 2 weeks, but they were were they 2 weeks? I don't even remember. They were very confusing.
There was no time.
But in terms of how often you had to meet, it was
once a month.
You had to meet. Yeah, I don't know.
You had to meet.
It was weird.
Yeah.
When we were getting our supervision, it was pretty loose.
It might have been even different when you guys were getting it, because you guys got your BCBAs a year or 2 years before me.
2 years, I think. Yeah.
Mine was are you working? Yes. Did you do it? Yes. Great. Bye.
Yes.
Yeah, it was an interesting process. I enjoyed my supervisor and I enjoyed my supervision time. But reading all these articles nowadays, I'm like, wow, we didn't do all of this. We didn't have all these checklists, and we didn't have all, my supervisor was always great at accepting feedback, but it wasn't her ethical responsibility written down that she had to take my feedback. None of that stuff. That didn't exist. So flash forward a little bit, and all of a sudden it was, supervision is not a skill you magically learn just by being good at behavior analysis. So we had our original 8-hour supervision course, and, they updated some of the expectations, but it really has only been, I think, the last, 4 or 5 years that it's felt like supervision has come into its own as a honed craft.
Sure. Well, I did the 8-hour supervision training in 2014. Mm-hmm. So even that is not that old. And that was the initiation of it. So that's not that old.
No.
At all.
But it still feels old.
We've had the 2.0 version. And then now with the 5th edition, they're bringing in teaching people how to supervise. Lo and behold, let's start when people are in school to teach them what to do. But it's all very recent.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I do want to say that with the 5th edition, you no longer can be a BCBA that just got their BCBA. and you have to be a BCBA for at least a year now, according to the 2022 standards, and taking the supervision curriculum, and have a qualified mentor watching you supervise in order for you to be a supervisor.
Yep.
So they have added layers into the new supervision requirements starting in January 2022.
Mm-hmm. But this leaves us with an issue of we have a field that is seeing exponential growth yearly. And if you picked a supervisor out of a hat, there is a good chance that they have been practicing BCBAs for less time than there have been any of these supervisory requirements. So if you have anyone who's like, I've been a BCBA for many, many years, they learn to supervise kind of on the fly. You know, what's that expression? We sort of learn how to fly. We built the airplane while we were sort of in the air because so much of what we had to learn as supervision, we had to learn while we were in the process of actually supervising people. Whilst supervising people. Or they learn to do it as part of their graduate studies, in which case they haven't been BCBAs for very long. So they themselves are still learning the ins and outs of the whole shebang. So in that regard, supervision is something that I think we've all learned to enjoy. We've learned much more about the science of supervision, but it's one of those areas of our practice, you know, we got to be competent where to some extent, given these changes, we're always sort of that hair's breadth away from maybe not following all of the best practices we possibly could because it's still such a recent development. Supervision itself isn't, but supervision, the way that, you know, it's been crafted over the past few years is. So what we're looking at, and this is actually from the Hajigomoseni article, is building a supervisory relationship, which in that article is defined as a competent professional serving in the role of the supervisor for an untrained, aspiring professional, the supervisee. Meaning, if you want to be a supervisor, you need to be competent, which is in itself an ethical requirement of any field that you practice in. So we'll be talking about these articles and thinking about what are the tasks that we could all do a little bit better on, and what are the barriers that might be keeping us from reaching those pinnacles of ethical supervision?
One thing that I think we should mention, Rob, is that with the new Ethics 2022 code, there are some differences in language that the glossary helps us out with when we're talking about trainees and supervisees. And so I just want to make that clear with people. A trainee is any individual accruing fieldwork or experience toward fulfilling eligibility requirements for the BCBA or BCA certification, and a supervisee is any individual whose behavior service delivery is overseen by a behavior analyst within the context of a agreed upon relationships. So supervisees can include RBTs, BCABAs, and BCBAs, as well as other professionals such as teachers, paraprofessionals, carrying out supervised behavioral services. So the BCBA does make this distinction between trainees, so those are the people that are actively pursuing a master's or the BCABA degree, and the supervisee is basically anyone else that the supervisor is supervising with a contract. So just want to make sure that's clear, because if you're listening in 2022 and beyond, right, those distinctions are important to make. I like them, though, because now it includes everyone, right?
Yes.
So in the old code, it didn't include everyone. It only included people that were getting their BCBA to be aware of the code, but now it's everyone that's being supervised by a behavior analyst with a contract.
Excellent. All right, well, why don't we get started, and let's start with the article that I know you said you'd been waiting for, and we didn't want to do this episode until it had been published, and fortunately it did in time for September, and that's the...
Thank goodness they aligned it to our schedule.
Were they listening to us? That was nice of them. And that's Hajigomoseni et al. 2021 survey results. Survey says...
I literally have been waiting for this article to be published for 1,000 years. Even though I didn't know it existed, but I knew somebody was doing it, right? So if you read between the lines, their survey went out in 2018. So it took them quite a number of years to publish these data, right? 2018, 2020, 2021, right?
That takes a while.
3 years. So just know that it takes a while, but it's an upgrade to the DiGiorno and read Survey the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from 2015.
Yeah.
Which I'm always like, I wonder what happened after the supervisor curriculum went out. Thank you. This made me so happy. I literally shrieked with glee when I found this. Just saying.
If you weren't already professor, they would have given you an honorary professorship just for that statement right there.
I even gave it recently to a marketing person. I was like, read this article. It is so good.
So when we look at the overall purpose, like you said, Jag, it's kind of a follow-up to what's going on now in the field of supervision for behavior analysts. And the survey was just looking at what are the repertoires of BCBA supervisors, looking at kind of, what variables are relevant to getting positive outcomes for trainees. So the authors looked at best practice from the literature, which they had, 8 kind of guiding articles, as well as, the BCBA Code Section 5 on supervising with some big questions.
It's Section
Number 1.
now.
Section 4 now. Well, it's 5 at the time of publication, but Section 4 now.
It is Section 4 now to make sure that, because they were doing it with the code, but now Ethics 2022, it's Section 4.
Yes. And the big questions were, how often are supervisors reporting the use of the recommended supervision behaviors, as in, what are the best practices out in the literature? Are there significant differences between, how people responded for each of the subsections of what was then Code 5, as well as a random miscellaneous category that wasn't included in any of the code updates, at least explicitly? Were there differences between these kind of average response means relative to, say, the demographics of the supervisor? And again, demographics mostly looking at sort of place of employment and like years of practice kind of. And then finally, is there any correlation at all between how supervisors report that they are following best practices and the outcomes of the trainees on the BACB certification exam?
Right. And I think these are really good questions because as our field has grown exponentially, right, from like 0 people to a bazillion people, I think that the supervisor-supervisee relationship or the supervisor-trainee relationship is one of the most important in direct care settings, right? And it's mainly overlooked because it doesn't bring the buck, so to speak, right? Like you can't bill for that sort of talk. Like you can't be like, hey, insurance company, I had a really stellar supervision meeting today. I'm going to bill $29292 for it, right? So I think a lot of companies don't value that supervision experience as much as they need to if they're looking primarily for the bottom line, which sadly a lot of behavior analytic companies are nowadays.
Yeah.
And I think
it's a whole other ethical quandary.
Right. And I think, based on my experience in the field and, working with graduate students, I think a supervisor relationship can make or break someone in our field that's new to the field, right? If you have a great supervisor your first year or two, you're, I think, more likely to move on and be excited versus if your supervisor that you have first like sucks and is like a super jerk to you. I think you're less likely to pursue going any further in the field because that's the representation of the field that they see, right? This supervision relationship.
Yeah.
And so I think this is like one of the most important things that behavior analysts need to think about, right? If we want our field to be better and if we want the people that work with our clients, because it's not us, right? As behavior analysts, we're like one of the only fields that don't work directly with our clients. And we need to make sure the people that are working directly with our clients are happy, they're productive, they're empathetic to the clients, and they're only going to be that way if we've taught them to be that way. And the only way that we're going to teach them is through that supervision and training.
Very true. Very true. And, I think supervision also is one of those funny things that I'm glad they have that question about what are the outcomes of supervision, because we know that good supervision and good training is kind of a mitigating factor for, say, burnout. But, there haven't been that many causational studies looking at like, I did all the things I'm supposed to do in the literature for best supervisor ever. And, there's no direct study. And then, those BCBAs, once they passed, they had such a great supervisor that they went on to become the greatest in the field, or they had high social validity for the rest of their career. Like that data doesn't exist. So a lot of this research is sort of based on, these seem like great strategies and they have high social validity. And we've seen some benefits in certain ways, but there's no sort of magic A to B sort of supervisory relationship. Like we know these supervisory practices are great in the literature that's sort of just talking about, hey, we think these are some good things to do. And you read those articles and you read them. And if you just read the suggestions, like, these sound great. And then if you read, the whole article in the beginning, it's like, a lot of these are based on other field books. And a lot of these are based on our own practice, which is a great place for, when you're just learning to be a supervisor, to get some tips of what is best practice, but doesn't necessarily mean these actually are going to result in the best outcomes. So I love that there was at least a look here. Is there a difference in outcome based on how good at least a supervisor reports that they are? So again, as much as there's some great results here, this is a survey. It was sent out on the BACB's mass email list that you have 4 weeks to respond. There were 315 respondents, which is about 1.1% of all the BCBAs out there as of 2018, I guess, when this survey went out. And the survey itself really took a lot of practices that were identified from 8 specific supervision articles. Those articles had a list of, here are some great ways to supervise, here are some other fields supervision tips, and based on those, they either got categorized into one of the points in the ethics code. Again, what was 5 and is now 4, so it's not going to be exactly the same. And anything that wasn't explicitly in the code or in the now current but soon to be old code, if you're listening to this in 2022, just got entered into a miscellaneous category, which kind of felt like a big confound in that the miscellaneous category was huge compared to the code categories, which were much smaller and had very few subcategories. Some of them had one subcategory, which to me just means a category.
Right. That makes sense to me, though, because the code at that time was not large, right? There was only like 6 or 7 different codes in the supervision standard. And I mean, you can't did you have a contract? You can't really subcategorize, did you have a contract? So I totally get that. And when I read that part, it is a confound for the survey, but it also led to me that there is so much more we need to do in order to be an ethical supervisor than just follow this code. And I think the new code does a little bit better, right? Because it adds in some newer standards that will help students advocate for themselves, help bring in culture, diversity into the supervision world, right? But I totally get it, because if you just followed the ethical guidelines for a supervisor, you would suck as a supervisor, right? You'd be like, I have my contract, I've evaluated you, I've monitored you, I've asked how I've done, I'm done, right? Because
I only have one supervisee well within my volume, yeah.
So then I totally get it. It makes sense. And I think what they did by having that expert panel, with having the BCBAs read all of the questions for clarity and significance and acceptability, and then have another panel of content review experts look at it, and then send that final expert. I think that's a way that they were trying to mitigate that, because they didn't want to just get at, are you an ethical supervisor, but what are the supervision practices? And at that time, we didn't really have that much. Spoiler, we still don't have that much, but we're getting better.
So just for clarity, I don't want to make everyone pull out their ethics handbook, their old one right now, especially if you're listening in, January or February, So
while you're driving.
Or while you're driving. So I'm just going to list, these were the categories they had. There was supervisory competence, supervisory volume, supervisory delegation, designing effective supervision and training, communication of supervision conditions, so, written contract, providing feedback to supervisees. I don't know if you guys caught this, but there was a typo in the text, not in one of the tables where they actually listed two of them twice. I was a little shame. Providing feedback to supervisees.
Not necessarily the author's fault.
Somebody made a mistake.
Just want to say.
Evaluating the effects of supervision. And then the miscellaneous category, which, some examples of what would be a miscellaneous best practice from research would be arrive on time, do group activities, discuss the fact you're going to give feedback, include ethics and various components, review the literature, schedule direct observations.
All necessary, right? All critical if you're going to be a good supervisor, although not ethical. But remember, ethics and supervision are not the same thing, even though they're besties. So if I was writing this and I was making an error, I would say, even though they're breasties, but, right? Even though they're besties, they're not mutually exclusive. You could still be an ethical supervisor and be a horrible supervisor.
Very true.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot that is not included.
Yeah.
So the surveys had, demographic kinds of questions on sort of, who are you as a professional? Things like, how long have you been practicing? What kind of certification type do you have? How long have you been a fieldwork supervisor? Your area of studies? How much prep time do you have? Where do you work? How many hours does your job let you do supervision? Just kind of a lot of questions about that. And then 46 questions related to all of the different categories and subcategories kind of listed above. Now, you might ask, hey, Robin, Jackie, and Diana, you guys mentioned that they pulled best practices from 8 articles. Are we ever going to talk or hear about those 8 articles? Well, I'm so glad you asked, listener, because of these 8 articles cited in the study, we've actually talked about 6 of them, or we'll talk about 6 out of 8 of them by the time this recording goes out. They'll be in the archive. We'll have made them.
We are outpacing the supervision literature that's coming out.
Supervision September is going to end pretty soon. We're going to run out of articles. So some of the articles they did, there was the LeBlanc, Heineke, and Baker 2012, which we discussed actually with Dr. Heineke on episode 156 on traumatic brain injury. There was Sellers, Alai-Rosales, and MacDonald 2016, which we're going to be discussing today, and we originally talked about at length in episode 152. There's Sellers, LeBlanc, and Valentino 2016 on sort of barriers to supervision, as well as Sellers, Valentino, and LeBlanc, a different 2016 on recommended practices for your individual supervision. We talked about that on episode 64, way back when in a previous Supervision September. There's the Turner, Fish, and Lucelli, which we talked about on episode 139 in last year's Supervision September, and are going to review again today on this episode. So we haven't talked about Ellis and Glenn 1995, which I had never heard of.
But we will. It's in a future.
I guess we should now.
Yes, we will.
It's in a future episode. Spoiler.
And then Valentino, LeBlanc, and Sellers 2016, and they did an article. They did one on individual supervision. This one was on group supervision. So of the, at least in this article, noted 8 amazing articles on being an amazing behavior analyst supervisor, we've talked about 6 of them. So hooray! We're really doing a great job there.
Feel good about that?
I do feel good. That's why I took all those notes on. I was like, I think we talked about all of these.
And we've done several book clubs on supervision.
That's right.
As well. Not that those got mentioned in this article.
No, they did not. So let's talk results. Jackie, what were they? There were tons of results. There's the demographic results. There were all the means and comparisons between all of them.
Oh, right. Nobody cares about that. So I did a golden nugget results. And I was like, okay. The good news is that most supervisors said they had some sort of training in supervision before they took on a supervisee or trainee, which was awesome, right? Step in the right direction. That's a complete contrast to the De Janeiro and Reed article in 2015, where like very few people had any sort of training, right? It's also good that some people said they had around a mean of an hour and a half of supervision per week that were allocated in their job. Sadly, which is not surprising, kind of alarming, that most people said that supervision was not incorporated into their workload at work, which I'm not surprised about talking to graduate students.
And while they said the time was allocated, there wasn't a matchup between time that was allocated to them and the time that they spent engaging in supervision and pre-supervision and post-supervision activities too.
Yeah. It was also quite alarming that those people that didn't have supervision allocated in their workload also had 10 or more clients and also 1 to 3 trainees. Really, so like, when are they going to have time to do anything? Which also makes me feel, kind of bad for them, because they're probably stressing out about how am I going to be a good supervisor when I have all these conflicting responsibilities going on. Which leads me back to my original point that the supervisee-supervisor relationship isn't valued in companies because it doesn't make the kind of money that you would need to. It's also really sad to see that some reported that they barely or sometimes use evidence-based supervision practices, even though there's articles written about them. The mean was 4, so that some people were using them, but not everyone. If you said barely, you should really think about, like, maybe I should use that. Right? If it's evidence-based and I'm not using it.
Yeah.
And then the other part, the last thing that was concerning to me, but again, not surprising, is that most of the respondents had their BACB certificate for 2 years or less. Right? Surprising? No. Alarming? Kind of. Right? Because they're probably not using the evidence-based practices because they don't know what they are. Right? Because they're young. And then I thought to myself, again, while I'm lying in my bed, thinking about this article in the middle of the night. I texted Diana and I was like, Diana, question about something in the middle of the night. But in the middle of the night, I was thinking, well, maybe it's because the more experienced BCBAs were too busy doing other things to do this survey. Could be, right? Because we didn't know, it wasn't a survey of every BCBA in the entire world. Like, I tend to not prioritize surveys because I just don't have time to do that. So who knows, like, what percentage of the BCBAs that were old versus newer BCBAs answered this, but probably not, just looking at the demographics of, you know, who's getting their BACB and how many people are passing, right? So those, I think, were my, like, main take-home points, that we're doing better than we were in 2015, but we're still not doing great.
Well, I thought what was sort of promising, and again, is it a matter of our field making sort of choices and targeting the low-hanging fruit, you know, low response effort behaviors first? But the responses that had the highest mean were probably the supervision behaviors that had been the clearest and sort of the easiest to do and had the most concrete examples. So, for example, almost everybody said, you know, high usually or almost always, they have a contract. Hooray, that's good. But, you know, if you did the survey 6 years ago, like we said, would any of us have had a contract? It would have been zero. I never have a contract for supervision. Why? I have my contract for work, right? So that was an example of, hey, everyone was told they needed a contract. They were given an example of a contract they could use, and making a contract is not particularly hard to update or edit or individualize for the supervisory relationship you're going to go into. So when we put the time in for at least some of these supervisory behaviors, it does appear that people at least report that they do that more. Whereas, like you were saying, Jackie, the behaviors that are more complicated. So assessing your supervisory activities, you know, having a supervisory curriculum, that's a lot harder. There aren't as many of those easily available. Depending on how long you've been in the field, you may not have easy access to that material or have built up your own material. So that's just going to be scored a lot lower. So it does point to, I think, as long as a field, we keep saying, okay, what's not going very well? We need to spend some time. Like, let's get the think piece articles on this code versus that code. I think, you know, we're going to hopefully keep seeing at least reported measures of improvement.
Well, one thing that I do appreciate about the new code that I think will help in this supervision process is that the new code it's not so concrete, right? It allows for a lot more flexibility than previous codes. And instead of saying, you have to do this, right? It says, you should do this. But if you can't, make sure you document all the steps on why you can and how you're trying to change it. And please follow that decision tree that they've given us, right? I can't believe they gave us a decision tree. It's like they were listening to our podcast.
I know.
Right? So
I love a good decision tree.
Like, the decision tree is like key here, right? It's right in the beginning, right in the glossary, or right before the glossary. It tells you, like, okay, if I have an ethical issue with a supervisor or a supervisee, I don't have to be like, okay, here it is. This is it. Nope, I have to follow this thing, right? The tree, and make sure, you know, I'm following all the things and make sure I'm being ethical, advocating for myself. I just love that. And I also love another thing about the ethics code that brings in being a good supervisor are those core principles. So the core principles on the new ethics code, I think there are 4 of them. I'm not looking at it right now, but
there are 4, yeah.
Yes. Benefiting others, treating others with compassion, dignity, and respect, behaving with integrity, and ensuring our own competence. I think those are key to being a good supervisor, right? So here, when you're being an ethical supervisor and abiding by those core principles that are in our ethical code and help us decide how we are going to supervise others, how we're going to interact with the trainees or supervisees in our purview, if we're using those core principles, we're probably going to act more empathetically. We're probably going to be a little more, you know, objective because we have these guiding principles, which before I would ask tons of students that have recently taken ethics, what are the core principles of behavior analysis? And they would like list off the 10 or 9 that were part of like Kegel or whatever, 1998. But if you ask like a BCB that's been in the field for like 5 years, or like, what are the core principles? They'd be like, Did you hear that? No answer, right? Because it's not something we brought up. So I love that they've incorporated these core principles into the ethics code that help us as behavior analysts move forward in our field acting compassionately.
Mm-hmm. I think really the only other, we talked about sort of, what do the statistics tell us in terms of these responses? So if you are dead set, I'm going to be the best supervisor ever, and you're looking for a job, and this kind of gets repeated in the LeBlanc et al. 2020 article, you should go work at a place that tells you flat out, we love good supervision and we love ethical behavior, and we make sure this is a priority for our clinicians here. So if you don't really care about supervision, don't bother asking those questions. And if they say, when there's time, there's supervision, guess what? You're not going to have probably very much time for supervision. And you may be one of the people who ends up reporting in a future survey, as usually or rarely for some of the kind of supervisory best practices. And then finally, the correlations in terms of passing. You're not going to hang your hat on any of these data points. They're not a huge sample, but at the same time, the results also weren't very strong. It did seem that there were a few kind of weak positive correlations for pass rate. First of all, I don't know how they got pass rate because they didn't mention where it was in the survey. Were they looking at the worldwide certification pass rate, or were they asking each person, hey, do you know how many of your supervisees actually passed the exam?
Yeah, and I don't know. And I actually, because I didn't feel like that part was relevant, because their correlation and they were not strong on any front, I just decided to disregard that part. I mean, they asked the question, so they had to put it in there. But to me, none of that's really relevant because it's correlation. And it wasn't like, it was all like, they're like, maybe this, but nothing. I don't think I could glean anything from that was like, this is a best practice because of this data. That's why I didn't put it in my notes, because I didn't.
No, and I wouldn't say it's best practice, but I think there are a couple points that, something to think about for the future or explore more in the future in terms of, what did anything have a correlation? And so again, weak, strong correlations in terms of adding ethics, doing a literature review, which to me, I think that puts a little research base on, if you ask, is ABA and SETRAC helpful in getting you to pass the exam? Maybe there's a teeny tiny bit of research that might point to that. I can't say for sure. I'm not going to put it on the website exactly. But there was one part that I thought was something I would like people to look into more, and that there was one negative correlation between passing rate and supervisory practice. And it was weirdly evaluate client performance. And the authors go into this a little bit, and I have sort of my own thoughts on it that I think mirrored theirs, which is one thing I'd be worried about as a supervisor. If you're in one of those fields where you've got 12 clients or 30 clients and like 2 or 3 supervisees, you may do a lot of supervision that is, I'm observing you working with the client. And how much of that is, I don't have time to actually meaningfully supervise you. So what I'm going to do is my job, which is helping this client, with a behavior of interest to that client. And since you're here, we'll call it supervision, and I'll give you some feedback at the end of this. And that was one thing I sort of worried about. Are there BC-based supervisees out there that are just doing their normal job and counting it as supervision because their supervisee happens to sort of like be in the same room? And I can't say that's a fact or that's actually happening, but they did come out with that as a negative correlation. So one thought could be, could that be a reason that there was a negative correlation? Because these people got tons of supervision. However, they weren't really being supervised. They just were present while behavior analysis was going on around them in the hope that it sort of all worked out in the end. Maybe not. But just something I was thinking of, and that the authors talked a little bit about that I wanted to bring up, especially given how many people are supervising in sites that don't care that they're supervising. It's sort of like, well, if you want to do that, fine, but you better get your job done.
Well, I think you don't want to discount the value of observation for the client's benefit and for the benefit of all of your staff who are working with those clients. But if you're there and seeing the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm going to watch the hand washing program again, then that likely is going to have limited return.
We got to get those observations in, let's do it.
Trainees need to learn.
Right.
So it's not that it's a bad thing if you're observing, but it may not be hitting all of the points necessary.
It's a good thing that could be misused.
A well-rounded experience for your trainee.
What was more telling for me is that the people that were responding were less than 2 years out of their BCBA, so they don't know different tactics with their clients, right? So they're looking for their performance, but they don't know how to do it differently, right? Because they're new still. And so I think that would have been a better question, is looking at like how far out has your supervisor been from like graduating versus client performance, because I think there's a lot going on there.
Well, they had years in the field, and they certainly did make the sort of milquetoast point of, we agree that you should be practicing for over a year, which to me, I wanted to say, just a year? Are you sure? Yeah. We don't want to be, but I get there's a push and pull that if we were like, no, you have to have been a practicing BCBA for 5 years before you provide supervision, we wouldn't be able to grow our field, because there'd be too many people who need supervisors and not enough people who've been in the field for 5+ years to provide that supervision.
Yes, the majority of people in the field now have had their BCBA for less than 5 years.
Right.
But 1 seems low. I think you think maybe 2. There's got to be a mathematical number that both is ethical and not totally stunting to the field.
Yeah, and there's going to be variance in the quality of someone's supervision regardless of how many years they've been a BCBA. So you could have someone who's been a BCBA a long time and they haven't taken the time to develop those skills, because it's a skill set. Mm-hmm. It's, a set of behaviors that can be learned just like anything else. But if you haven't devoted the time and energy to doing that, then you're unlikely to be a good supervisor. You won't just like luck into it usually. Right? People of our BCBA generation, we had to kind of learn it on our own. So there's a whole variety, I think, of quality that you might experience. And then there may be someone who, now the new BCBAs coming up are going to have at least had a course in it. So they're going to have the language surrounding it and know some of the literature related to it, which is really exciting. So they may be better prepared coming out the gate than someone who hasn't taken the time to learn that material.
Oh, I totally agree that length of time as BCBA does not equal good supervisor. But I would say that some length of time as a BCBA is a prerequisite to be a good supervisor. Now, I don't want to knock any of you just getting out of grad program and you're like, I love supervision, it's my jam, and I know I'm going to be good at it. I'm sure you are going to be good at it. It's just nobody is the best they're going to be right out of grad school.
But the nice thing about the new graduates that are coming out in 2022, well, not only they have the class, but they'll also have the supervision curriculum, right? So it's like double dipping. They've they're like introduced to it, they've tried it out, but then they have to try it out again in the supervision training, the 8-hour supervision training. So I just like that. I like that they're adding more layers.
Yeah.
Well, that's our survey result. We went a long time, but this was kind of our keystone research article for this episode. We're going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, let's get into a little bit more concrete practice. We're moving out of surveys. We're getting into practice and ethical supervision tips and tricks. I hate tips and tricks as a phrase, but let's use it. Tips and tricks. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there!
And we are back talking about the ethics of supervision. But before we get into our last set of articles, I want to remind listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. And by listening to the show, you're able to earn 1 ethics or 1 supervision CE. It's your choice. Yay! All you have to do is finish listening to the episode, then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/getceus. That's CEUS and enter in your secret code words. Which secret code words, Rob? Well, I'm going to tell you the first one now. Hold on. It's blackberry, BLACKBERRY. It's a delicious fruit. It's not my favorite fruit, so I don't want to overstate the deliciousness of blackberry. It's a pretty good fruit. It's pretty good fruit. You can pick them off a bush and eat these blackberries if you're in some parts of the world. Some of you might be like, I refuse to let go of the early 2000s and I have a BlackBerry phone. I'm so sorry for you. But, that might be what you're thinking of.
Whatever happened
I hope
to that
not,
company?
Though. They must have gotten bought by somebody and they leveraged like some of their technology to do some nefarious business purpose at this point. Because I don't think there's still a phone you can go to purchase at the store.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Yeah.
Were they called that because they look like a BlackBerry with the little black buttons?
I don't think so. I have no clue. I never had a BlackBerry phone because I was not an investment banker in the 2000s. So I never had a BlackBerry.
Missed out.
Yeah, sorry.
That's how I made my millions.
Oh, okay. That's good to know. BlackBerry. All right. So moving on, we just talked about a very long survey, looking at, well, how can you up your supervision game? And one of the factors that statistically, at least with these responses of a survey, seemed to point to better use of best supervisory practices is work in a place that gives you time for supervision or gives you time to think about your job. And, well, how do I do that? That seems hard. Well, we have talked about some articles that discussed, supervision frameworks, but LeBlanc and colleagues in 2020 put out the next article we're going to discuss is looking at ethical discussions. And when we think about supervision as continuing on with ongoing training and discussions and making it a part of the job, because again, insurance ain't paying you for good ethics. They're just not fining you or finding you in contempt of, some sort of legal shenanigans if you follow your ethical guidelines. But how do you promote this type of behavior? Well, it's actually kind of complicated, and it doesn't just happen by saying, we love ethics here at company. So LeBlanc and colleagues at Trumpet Behavioral Health in 2012 put together an ethical team or an ethical network. And Linda LeBlanc, I love your articles. I love how many of these great, here's how to make your business the best business that ever was articles. But, could you give other people a chance to have some fun ideas? Because you had all the good ideas. All right, you got to stop. Let some other people have some fun ideas. I kid, of course, but thank you so much for writing. This is like one of a series. I don't know. Does Linda have a book out of making an awesome business and just take these articles that she's written on these topics and just here it is, everybody. Follow the manual.
Probably giving her some ideas.
I'm sure somebody was like, Linda, look at all these articles. Just seriously, make a narrative around them, put some anecdotes and pictures. You got a bestseller. I made an amazing ABA company. Now you can too. The Linda LeBlanc story, or
it's not that easy.
The Linda LeBlanc story, I like that. It's like a made-for-TV movie.
Yeah, who will play Linda LeBlanc in the new movie? She'll be playing herself. It's amazing. She can do everything. All right. So we talk about supervisory work being ethical work. Again, how are we supposed to promote good ethical practice in day-to-day? Because unlike, maybe some of your initial graduate student ethics 101 case studies, most ethical situations are kind of complex and are going to occur at a time when you least expect them to happen. And if you haven't actually been preparing for them by following up with ethical practice and exercising those ethical muscles, they're going to catch you unawares. And if you're lucky, they're just not the dangerous ethical violations that you actually are going to go to jail about. They're the small ones where you apologize and figure out how you can learn more about it and then improve immediately. So LeBlanc and colleagues sort of looked at what are the actual most of at least alleged violations for the ethical code according to the BACB. So they looked at the numbers from 2016 and saw that codes relating to supervision and codes relating to failure to report to the board, so that's old code 5 and 10, were the highest submitted violations, with code 1 being kind of the third highest. Now, they've done an update since then, and supervision, fortunately, has moved down to the fourth most cited violation. And that makes sense because in 2016, supervision was kind of brand new, so it probably would have been pretty easy for people to have ethical code violations relating to supervision because we just kind of learned that was such a thing we should be paying attention to. The other piece that LeBlanc and colleagues bring up is that while there are so many complex situations, it's not like you can always predict which complex ethical situations are going to occur. And many ethical situations actually can be resolved by having a conversation. What went wrong? Here's how I'm going to fix it in the future. Here are the steps I'm taking. Here's how I documented it. And everyone is happy and more ethical afterwards. That's actually the ethically supported practice as well. Talking to the person with whom you believe there is a possible ethical violation. So way back in 2012, Linda and colleagues set up their ethics network because they decided, you know what we need to have? We need to have a comprehensive plan for our ethical behavior, because it's not going to be good enough if, you know, the people in charge are the most ethical people in the world. Because it's not like ethics is, you know, it's not like trickle-down economics ethics. It's not like, oh, well, I'm the boss and I'm ethical, therefore everyone else will be. While an administrator being ethical is kind of a prerequisite for having everyone in your organization be ethical.
Yes.
It doesn't just magically happen because, you know, it's like, I'm near this person who's so ethical. Everyone will now be ethical. You just have to work at it.
Right. Well, there's a lot to be said for modeling the behavior, but how much contact do people have regularly with the person who's running the company? Probably very little.
They have to walk around and sprinkle ethics dust on over all their employees as they go throughout their day.
You got to create a culture, and it's not that easy to create that type of culture.
You know what? I love that, though. I love an article that says, we did this cool thing, and guess what? It was hard and required lots of time and effort. Because I think it sends a message to all the practitioners who are reading these articles saying, thank goodness, it's not something that I was born unethical, and that's why I'm not good at ethics. Like, no, it takes time and work to be ethical. That's what I thought in high school when they made us take ethics. I was like, I'm a good person. I don't need to take this class. I don't want to steal from anybody. And then they're like, no, ethics is complicated. And I said, I hate this class. I want ethics to be easy.
You really like the black and white.
That's right. That's why I'm going to be the villain in the movie.
I love living in the gray.
Yeah.
That's why you love the new gray. That's why you love the new 2022 code, because you can, right?
That's right. Yes, exactly.
Well, at least they explain how to live in the gray. They explain how to live in the gray better with that code. Whereas the old one, it's sort of like, do this or you're a bad person. It's a little scary.
I just love when the old code came out and people remember, and they were looking like, if you get a ticket, then you need to report to the ACB. And then everyone's like, I got a parking ticket, because we're all like such rule followers. And they're like, oh my gosh, one time I spent 62 and a 55. I submitted it to the BACB, and they had to write that newsletter being like, no, that's not what we mean.
Everyone calm down. I think it's good for behavior analysts to hear that you can do some living in the gray.
Yeah.
Right? Because not every situation is cut and dried. Very often, there are going to be complex situations where all sides need to be considered, and there's no good, straightforward answer. And you can't have just a set of rules that you always pull out and follow to a T. Life is much more complicated than that. And the type of work that we're doing is much more complicated than that. So attempting to create an ethics code that can live and breathe and house those much more complex scenarios is what we really need. And to have people understand that it's okay to not know the answer right away, it's going to take some time to figure out, is part of how our field's going to continue to grow.
Yeah. So this ethics network that LeBlanc and colleagues put together really had some main goals, which were, number one, get some infrastructure around ethics and initial training and ongoing training having to do with ethics. Set up ethical decision-making processes at all levels of the organization so that the culture at Trumpet was one of, we all engage in ethical decision-making all the time, no matter who you are. Also to kind of get data and then use that to create relevant written information so that they were easily able to figure out, where aren't we being as ethical as we'd like to be? Or at least where are staff reporting concerns about ethics that we could put more of our time and effort in? So kind of filling those gaps. And then also doing, lots of, initial, follow-up trainings, ongoing journal clubs, clinic team meetings, annual, big ethics meetings. And then also setting up their own internal ethics hotline, which, if you can make your own ethics hotline, like Dr. John Bailey, I think ethics hotlines are cool. I like ethics hotlines. Whether you're a Trumpet, whether you're just out on the interwebs, I love them. Except Trumpet they don't return my calls because I don't work there. So it's really to do all of this work, however, and again, I love this. It wasn't like, we had one person who was just a go-getter and they put it all together. No, they had a whole team that included the executive director, which I believe at the time was Linda LeBlanc. They had ethics chair and an ethics assistant chair, and they had this great little system where someone would volunteer and then they'd be in charge. They kind of get voted in, and then the assistant would be the person who the second year would take over. So everyone was always learning to be the ethics chair. Who was interested in that role? You'd have the job for only 1 year, and sort of, oversaw most of the ethics work. And then there was an ethics team that were volunteers from all over the company. So it wasn't like we only want our BCBADs or no RBTs apply. Anyone could volunteer to become a part of the ethics team. And then you have, sort of your clinical teams, your other administrative teams that you need to run your company who were considered sort of, the far end of the ethics network. They sort of did a lot more of the dissemination of the material. So some of the key components of this ethics network were everyone starts at our company with some ethics training, and not just here are the ethical codes, I guess you should follow them, but everything had to do with the idea of problem solving. And again, the problem solving strategy that was listed is sort of the one that's kind of in the new code right now. And I think we talked about with Darren and Adele's book, in terms of how do we think of ethics problems, in that you have kind of 6 steps. You recognize the problem, you define the problem, generate some solutions, evaluate the pros and cons of those solutions, put the solution into play, and then evaluate, did that solution actually solve the ethical problem? So that became something that they focused everyone on learning from day one. Well, I don't know if it was day one, but early on in their hire.
That was in episode 105, by the way, Ethics Mailbag.
Yeah, I like that one. And then, again, like in the current code, there are overarching concepts when we talk about the foundations of ethical and professional behavior. So not quite the same, but there was at least a similar phrasing. So, do no harm, work within your boundaries, focus on confidentiality of the clients and the others you work with, and be professional. Again, so a lot of the same ones underpinning the code. And they have all sorts of visuals showing how these were, the core components. They were the pillars of everything we do here. So from day one, ethics is in your face. It's loud and in your face. The things related to creating ethical decision making came in the fact that they had this cool ethics network where they were getting back to people within 1 to 2 weeks, because it's a company where ethics isn't something they're getting paid for. It's something they wanted to promote. So they'd have this elaborate system of, the most important cases would go to the director, cases that weren't an emergency, as said by the person who was putting in the ethical question to the hotline, would get a response within a week or two, and the ethics chair would determine who in this organization is the best to answer this question, which I think is one of the nice things about being in a big organization is you have all these resources to pull from. The other part I liked about the ethical network questionnaire is you didn't just write, yeah, here's the situation I find myself in and I'm really worried it's an ethical violation. The whole thing was set up, the little questionnaire was set up like that problem solving model. So while you were asking your ethics question, you were going through the process of trying to problem solve the ethical dilemma you were in. So even if you were totally wrong, that didn't matter. You at least were practicing the skill of ethics every time you were concerned about a possible ethical violation. So that was really great. And then from that data and from ongoing meetings that they would do with the ethics team, they would sort of divvy up who's going to do the various trainings, in-services, journal clubs with the authors of ethical tomes and ethical research papers, who's going to run those. So they could delegate a lot of those responsibilities. So there was almost always something coming out. There were like quarterly meetings with all the clinicians and administrators. All of these trainings were tailored to the groups that they were going to be teaching. And then they also did things like, every week they had like a fun fact email with like visuals or videos of ethical behavior, infographics, monthly talking points. And again, some of these, they were very clear that they recycled. So, hey, it's around the holidays. Guess what? Everyone's getting the infographic from last year about ethics of gift giving, right? They probably have to update that one with the new code. Water, yes. New car, no.
Unless it's under $10.
Yeah, like a toy car, maybe, but I don't know. I don't know if you want to accept a toy car. That seems a little dicey. And between all of this, again, they were able to set up a system in which from day one you're learning ethics. It's constantly a source of conversation. And they're giving people a means of accessing ethical problem solving, both teaching them how to ethically problem solve, as well as having someone around who can help them with ethical problem solving. So really their goals were, can we make ethics a low response effort behavior, or at least pursuing ethics lower response effort behavior? Can we remove the potential coercive factors that lead people to avoid talking about ethics or avoid acting ethically? And they use the data from their hotline to sort of look at some of the patterns of ethical behavior. So again, I love that they had this really cool article describing this whole structure. And then at the end, they're like, and here's some results. And, they're the results from one company looking at 3 years worth of data. So I think it's valuable, but it did sort of suddenly turn into like a research paper. I didn't quite know that's what I was reading. And then there's some results like, oh, okay, great. I'll read these, I guess. So looking at the patterns from, I think it was 2019 to 2021, from how many submissions they had in their network, 137 submissions. And what they found was that, again, mostly it was kind of like people at the BCBA level who were submitting these codes. Most people who submitted a code violation were able to identify at least one code that was potentially violated. But what was interesting is the experts who then would sort of respond usually would find an average of like 1.4 relevant codes. So, almost 2. So again, there was a need for this extra ethics training because most people were missing certain, potential violations, which I think is important in ethics because most of us can pick out the really big ethical concerns in the job, but there's always those subtle ones that really sneak up on you that if you're not thinking about them all the time, you can miss. The codes that were noted mostly were, old code 1.06 about multiple relationships, and then maintaining confidentiality 2.06, old 2.06. Were sort of the most asked. Surprisingly, even though code 10 was actually pretty high, the failure to report to the BACB or responsibility to the BACB in the BACB summary, Trumpet did not have that. Most people were not concerned about, oh no, I didn't tell the BACB something that went on, I guess. Also, the number of submissions to the network stabilized over time, which again could just be a sign that people felt comfortable using this network, learned that the network even existed. There are a lot of reasons that could happen. But it did seem that with all this effort and with all this time, there was at least some removal of barriers to ethical decision-making and seeking out ethical support. Again, was it a matter of, hey, we're giving people the chance to always be seeing ethics and always talking about ethics. So ethics isn't something we talk about when somebody has an ethical violation, which of course we mostly associate feedback. If we're not behavior analysts or people who actually know how to use feedback as a scary thing. It's associated with when we messed up, when we're in trouble. So we want to avoid it. It's paired with punishment. So we tend to just want to get away from it. I think ethical violations or ethical talk can be that. I'm sure many of you say, I don't want to talk about ethics. It was the last thing, on earth. I don't want to talk about ethics. So potentially some of that, aversiveness of ethics discussion was removed. This wasn't that kind of a study, but just really kind of a fascinating way to sort of build in a core of ethics. And again, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about supervision. These two things can be interchangeable. You can add all of this in your organization. LeBlanc and colleagues are very clear. Hey, this isn't something that's going to work for every single organization. So if they had to give you one, you're the boss of an organization and they want to give you one tip, it would probably be pick a few areas that were discussed in the article and sort of maybe start looking at data of, are there concerns or have you had ethical violations in your organization? And that's really where you want to start your fun fact emails and your in-service trainings. But it's something that you want to always be doing. It doesn't have to be something they do at this level, but you should always be presenting ethics. So it's an always decision. It's an always discussion, not something that comes up when somebody got in trouble.
I like that article a lot.
It's fun. Again, Linda, I'll edit it. I'm gonna edit your book, take all the articles, and we're gonna write your story. Just give me a call.
In my old place of work, they would have ethics brown bag lunch once a month.
I did love
those. We get together and talk about ethical scenarios.
That's fun.
Yeah.
That was.
It helps promote the culture, right? Where ethics is something you talk about, you discuss. Just because you bring up a scenario doesn't automatically mean that you have violated some ethical code, right?
Violation question for a friend.
Right.
That's my favorite in class. They're like, this is a hypothetical. And it's like, so I mean.
All right. Well, let's bring it home with some updates to some. They're not that old because supervision discussion is not that old. But 2016, update to some articles that we've discussed at length. Like I said, if you want to hear us talk at length about Sellers, Alai-Rosales, and MacDonald, that's episode 152. If you want to hear us talk at length about Turner, Fisher, and Lucelli, it's episode 139. So here are some updates, because we've got updates to our supervision curriculum. We've got updates to our ethics code. So Dinah and Jackie, take it away. What are the updates from these great articles that we need to keep in mind now that it's a brand new year?
All right, I can go. So I talked before in episode 139, I believe, about the Turner et al. Article, and it still stands, right? This is a fantastic article. I really love this one because they, wanted to go in there and break down what are the components that are needed to do really high quality supervision and how are we going to ensure that everyone's getting a complete experience, both the supervisor and the supervisee. And it breaks it down in a really lovely way. So all the update that needs to happen here is for us to think about how, with the new 2022 ethics code, do we see some of the pieces that Turner and colleagues highlighted reflected in our new ethical responsibilities as of 2022 as BCBAs in that section 4, which is the supervision section. So to make sure that we know everything in that section, I thought we could just run down what they were. So I'm just going to say the titles of those 12 codes that are in the section 4. So the first one, 4.01, is compliance with supervision requirements. 4.02 is supervisory competence. 4.03 is supervisory volume. How many people you supervise. 4.04 is accountability in supervision. 4.05, maintaining supervision documentation, everyone's favorite. 4.06, providing supervision and training. 4.07, incorporating and addressing diversity. 4.08, performance monitoring and feedback. 4.09, delegation of tasks. 4.10, evaluating effects of supervision and training. 4.11, facilitating continuity of supervision. And 4.12, appropriately terminating supervision. So just highlighting so everyone knows what those titles are.
When you're a supervisor, you don't want to be a terminator. You always got to say, I'll be back.
That's right.
Unless the contract specifically, describes a situation that has occurred.
Wow, Rob.
Thanks so much.
That's why you hired me.
Yes.
Right. So in this article, they talk about how you're going to set up your practice model for behavior analytic supervision. You want to make sure you're setting the occasion for a collaborative and ethical supervision experience for your trainees. So that covers a bunch of stuff, right? That covers all of those initial areas of the new code, the compliance with the standards, that you're competent in your supervisory skills, you're only supervising within the scope of what you know about, that you recognize how many trainees you can have on your supervisory caseload and are not exceeding that number, and that you're holding yourself accountable in the supervision process. So all of that is really incorporated there. And then they go on to say, you want to make sure that you define the relationship so it's clear what the expectations and goals are for both the trainee and the supervisor. And they do mention here that everyone's coming into the supervisory experience with a different history with regard to being supervised and or supervising, and that includes differences in their cultural background, reinforcement history, personal values, beliefs, etc. So I felt like this was probably a good place to kind of weave in that new 4.07. I wrote it down wrong. 4.07, incorporating and addressing diversity. So I'm so glad that this is here, because we need to be thinking about how we work with trainees, just as we think about clients, right? Like everyone, no one's a blank slate. Everybody's coming in with their own background, and we should not make assumptions about our trainees, just as we should not make assumptions about our clients, about what's going to be important for them, what they value. And it just speaks to how we need to get to know everyone and be respectful of varying backgrounds and cultures. So super pleased to see that there. They talk about making sure that the performance expectations are clear. So that pulls in 4.05, 4.04, accountability and supervision, and then 4.05, maintaining that supervision documentation, baby. You got to have it all in there.
So much paperwork.
You're canceling meetings. You need to make sure you're letting people know ahead of time. If you're having meetings, you need to make sure that you're documenting those meetings.
In case you can't tell from listening to me on the show for multiple episodes, my favorite part of supervision is the part where I sort of just do a podcast live for the person. I don't really want to write down what I said. Like, it's gold. I hope you wrote it down. It's great stuff.
You getting this? You getting all this?
Great stuff.
And then, not just do you need to make sure that you're doing all of those things, but also giving the trainee the opportunity to evaluate how the supervision experience is going, and both parties to evaluate what those performance expectations really are. So everyone knows by this point, I think, that you got to have a contract, right? And your contract
survey says
contract needs to include how that relationship is going to eventually end and or transition into a different type of relationship. So that hits on 4.11 and 12, continuity and or discontinuation of supervision. You want to make sure all of that's in there. And then the Turner article takes us through, you've set up your supervision experience, but what are you going to do during your supervision experience? You want to make sure that you first assess what are the necessary skills for your trainee to work on. And you can do that through observation. You can do that through talking to them, finding out what their goals are. And then after you have that assessment done, then you want to actually help teach them the things that they want to learn about. So there's, several things that are going to fall into those categories, such as 4.06, providing supervision and training, 4.08, performance monitoring and feedback, and then 4.09, delegation of tasks. So what can you provide for your trainee to work on that you're going to continue to supervise them doing after you have trained them appropriately? Performance feedback is an important piece. They go into that in a little bit more detail. There's so much to learn if you're a supervisor on how to provide feedback appropriately that we're only clearly scratching the surface on here. But that's in the ethics code too, is that you are monitoring performance and providing feedback in a way that's going to be helpful for your trainee, and that you yourself, if you're the supervisor, are modeling those soft skills that are really necessary to maintain this relationship and make it be as fruitful as possible for your trainee. And then you want to make sure that you're evaluating the outcomes of supervision, and that can occur through self-reflection as a supervisor, and also giving your trainee the opportunity to tell you, how did things go? And that's good. You could do that orally. You could do that with a survey. It's good to have a variety of options and thinking about how you're going to really measure those outcomes over time. So
Donna, if I was a supervisor, look up into the stars, and I put my hand on my chin, kind of like this, like listeners can't see, but you can see. Would that be accurate and quality self-reflection?
Yeah. So like a George Michael pose. Yep.
I did it?
Yep, that's exactly. That's all you have to do, actually. It's not function, it's just form.
That's the topography of self-reflection.
All right, but that last one is 4.10, evaluating the effects of supervision and training. So they seriously, even though this article is 5 years old, and this ethics code isn't even coming out until next year, all of these pieces that are going to be in the supervision section of the ethics code are reflected in the Journal article. So it really stands the test of time.
Do you think maybe when they were rewriting the code, they were looking at some of these articles,
might be
perhaps?
It could very well be possible. It's a good one, though.
No, they were on it. They asked experts in the field.
Well, that's the whole idea. I mean,
and there's only 8 articles on supervision, so they didn't have that many experts they had to go to.
Everything should be iterative in that way, that you're building upon what you already know. So that's all I got to say about that.
Man, isn't that fun, everyone out there? If you've been listening to these episodes or you're just reading these articles on your own, isn't it funny to see all these new codes and be like, wow, I kind of already knew this. Whoa. Does it blow your mind? It's like learning that adults aren't right all the time. When you're a kid, it's like, what?
I have this t-shirt that says 10 out of 10 people agree that we all agree, which I think is pretty funny. And this is, it's a little bit of that going on here, right? Okay, Jackie.
I included the Sellers article to this list, not to really discuss, but to think about the weight and seriousness of supervision, right? So the purpose of this article was to highlight all of the different ethical codes and how you, as a responsible supervisor, are in charge of everyone that you supervise, supervisee, trainee, regardless of if you're there or not. Right? So all of their professional work, professional behavior is your fault, even if you're not there. Right? And
yikes.
That's scary, right? And so
he's doing it again. He's making a face.
Because it sometimes keeps me awake at night, no lie. Or it wakes me up in the middle of the night. Because when you think about that, the enormity of a supervisor's job is it's crazy to comprehend, right? Not only are you in charge of people's lives and making them better, you're also in charge of all of these other people that are adults and presumably functioning as adults, right?
When you stare into the supervisory void stares back at you.
Yeah, it gets scary. And so I like to put this one in here because they give us really good examples on how to conceptualize each one of the standards. They're now called standards. So each one of the standards, and they're all still relevant, right? Because they didn't take any of the supervision standards out. They only added So they incorporated 4.07, which is addressing and incorporating diversity. They included compliance with supervision requirements. 4.01, they included facilitating continuity of supervision and also appropriately terminating supervision. So I think those were all embedded in other pieces of the old code, but they weren't specifically outlined. So I think that is one way that the Sellers article, you can find all of that in the Sellers article in their examples, right? But they're not specifically outlined as such. So I think it's just a good article if you're feeling like, oh, I'm the best supervisor in the world. Read that article. Like, knock yourself down a little bit. Recognize that you're not the best supervisor in the world, even if you are, because nobody's the best at anything, especially supervision, because we have a lot to learn. And I think that's
a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
That's one of those articles that I always come back to. So anytime I'm going to talk about supervision, I'm going to put it in there just to like put some weight on the situation. So that's all I really want to say about that one.
Yeah. So again, I think these two are great ones to review. They're always good, especially if you're, working in a company, you're working in a school where it's sort of a new year's coming up and maybe there's some new folks joining the team who need supervision. These are great articles to come back to. And now we brought them back to your attention and we updated some of the numbers that are referenced so that you can have those new numbers in mind as you go into 2022. And if you are out there and you're like, oh man, I'm writing my article where I just write the exact same article with new numbers, guess what? We scooped you. So if you write that article, you have to cite us now because we already said it. So we'll call you on it. We'll call you on it. We'll call you out. You know who you are. Because it would be me. I just want to write the article where I'm like, this was a great article, but the numbers changed. So here are the new numbers. New numbers, taking full responsibility of the other by me, entire Sellers.
I bet she'd appreciate that.
You might need to check with her.
We just did it. We did it as a courtesy, to Tyra's awesome article. So there it is. It's out there. All right. And with that being said, we got two new ones, bring back two classics, the 2016, and they're already classics. And that brings us to the end of Supervision September. Or does it? Does it, Diana? Is this the end of Supervision September already?
So it's not quite the end of September. So in that sense, it's not the end of Supervision September. However, this is the last week that you're going to get a Supervision CEU from us, potentially, if you want one, in September. Because next week, we're going to touch on some aspects of supervision, but the episode itself is going to be for ethics credit.
I love that order, too, because we're going to be talking about sort of similar to some of the themes we had today, which is how do you keep promoting these behaviors? And sort of LeBlanc and colleagues had an idea, and we'll be speaking with Dr. Manny Rodriguez, who comes from the organizational behavior management side of things, to review work that he has done looking at what makes an ethical leader and how do they create an ethical ABA workplace as well. So it's kind of a boots on the ground. Well, I guess LeBlanc and colleagues are boots on the ground as well, but it's even more boots on the ground descriptions of what that process entails from the business side of things. So very exciting, and that'll wrap up Supervision September fully. So we'll do the song and dance, the Supervision song and dance on that episode instead, I guess. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode. If you are interested in either that ethics or Supervision CE, our second code word is adventure, ADVENTURE. Because as we all know, the greatest adventure is behavior analytic supervision. And the treasure was really the friends we made along the way.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So just for clarification, everyone, you can order this episode for one Ethics CEU or one Supervision CEU. You don't have to tell me which one you're going to use it for. When I send it to you, it will say Ethics or Supervision, and then whichever one you need it for, you enter it into the BACB portal as that one.
I mean, if you want to speak to your computer, this is ethics or this is supervision, as you're printing out your certificate, you go ahead and do that. We won't know because it doesn't matter. It's the portal that matters.
But it's only worth one credit.
Pick one.
You pick one of the two.
Choose your own adventure.
Yeah.
If you put in two, that's unethical and you're not modeling good supervision. All right. Well, thank you all so very much for listening. Thank you, Diana and Jackie, for coming on this Supervision Ed venture with me and the listeners.
You're welcome.
If you enjoyed ABA Inside Track, we would love it if you subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you like to get podcasts. A couple other ways you can get the show. You can certainly go to the website, abainsidetrack.com, to find the episodes, links to the articles we discussed, as well as places to purchase CEs. You can find these on YouTube with the YouTube subtitling feature. And if you're interested in getting these episodes a week ahead of time, as well as some bonus extra content, why not join us on patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can subscribe for just $5 a month to get those extra a week ahead of time episodes. So your Supervision September would already be over at this point, as well as to subscribe at other levels to get extra content. Hooray, hooray, and discounts on CEs, all sorts of good stuff. You can also reach out to us a couple different ways. Certainly social media is always fun. We're ABA Inside Track on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, and Instagram. You can also email us at any time at abainsidetrack@gmail.com with thoughts, episode ideas, or just to say hello. Big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from Sycamore Workshop for his visual design. We'll be back next week with another full-length episode rounding out the month. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.